Y pues bienvenidos a un evento más organizado por la Asociación Mexicana de Estudios Internacionales y también por la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas. Yo soy Daniela Sandoval, voy a estar moderando el día de hoy magistral. Y va a realizar su conferencia en inglés, de manera que procedo. Welcome everybody to this conference. Our will give us a conference about. So I want to give him the final indications. Welcome. And well, he will have 60 minutes in total to give us his conference. So, Kristian is a Regius Professor of Political Science in the Department of Government at the University of Essex, of the Michael and Cooperation, and a research associate at the International Peace Research Institute. His research interests include conflict and cooperation, democratization, and spatial dimensions of social and political processes. He has a PhD in Science, University of Colorado, as well as a Master of Arts. Welcome, Kristian.
Muchas gracias. Para comenzar, me gustaría agradecer a May por la invitación de presentar en su conferencia anual. Tengo una conexión personal con México, ya que pasé un año en Monterrey como estudiante de intercambio hace casi 35 años. Lamento mucho no poder estar con ustedes en persona para esa conferencia, pero espero tener la oportunidad en el futuro, tal vez en la conferencia planeada entre Amey y Raisa. Unfortunately, I can't give the presentation itself in Spanish, but I would be more than happy to take any questions that you might have in Spanish if you wish. I have prepared some slides, so let me share my screen with you. So the topic of my talk today is the question of whether democracy is in decline. You might think that democracy is primarily an issue about domestic politics and institutions. But whether countries are democratic and how public opinion is represented plays a key role in many theories of international conflict and cooperation. And as such, the topic of whether democracy is in decline is more than just a descriptive question about individual countries. It's an issue where the answer has fundamental importance for what we think about the future outlook of global relations. In my talk today, I'm going to try to do three things. First, I will express skepticism about whether democracy actually is in decline, but I'll then try to look at why so many people clearly believe that it is, or are afraid that it may decline. Second, I want to underscore that being skeptical about whether there's a declining trend does not mean that democracy does not face serious challenges. It certainly does, and they merit our attention. But I will try to show that most of these challenges are not by any meaningful standard new challenges or recent trends towards the decline of democracy. Rather, they are enduring problems that have been with us for some time and likely to be with us in the future. And third, I'm going to argue that it's very important to get the diagnosis right, especially since predictions about the state and future of democracy have been so spectacularly wrong in the past. And many scholars have offered arguments about causes and prescriptions that have been very problematic. Now, before we come into my answer, let's look at the case for why many people often perceive democracy to be in decline. So the concerns about democracy being declined are actually quite diverse. On the one hand, we have some cases where hopes about reform processes and aspiration of democracy have been rolled back after the fall of a dictator, such as Egypt in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, before transitions have actually happened. We also have other countries where democracy has been unstable in the past, and now maybe under threat from leaders seeking to expand their power, with Turkey as a possible prominent example. And finally, and perhaps most paradoxically, we also have a new widespread perception that democracy is under threat in many countries where democracy has previously been believed to be well established in the West, either under the threat of right-wing populism or an erosion of individual commitments to democracy. The sense of decline here is underscored by many books with alarmist title, such as Levitsky and Ziblatt's How Democracies Die book, published in 2018. There are also several global data sources that claim to document the decline in democracy. The 2021 report by Freedom House, for example, is entitled Democracy Under Siege. The Vden data at the University of Gothenburg that we'll talk about later, they have also published several reports with alarmist title, including most recently Democracy in Retreat and Democracy Facing Global Challenges. Now, as I've said, the case for democracy being in decline at the present is sometimes held to be backed up by global data sources. So as good empirical social scientists, it is instructive to try to look at what data on trends in democracy actually show. We have many data sources that try to measure institutions and the degree to which they are democratic. One such source is the so-called polity data. And what I've done here is to plot trends in the polity data over time. And this figure, I've singled out three types of polities based on their distinction between democracies, anocracies, and autocracies. And the green line here shows proportion of countries in the world that are considered to be democratic by the criteria in the polity data. Now, one of the first things that we notice here is that in these data, there doesn't appear to be any clear evidence of a recent decline in democracy. If anything, we have a marked increase in democracy from the late 1970s, peaking perhaps after 2000, and then it may be leveling off, but there's no obvious decline in these data since then. Now, this counts each country as one observation, and you might argue that it would make sense to weigh countries by their size or their population share. When we do that, we get somewhat different trends, especially in the early periods where much of the world's population live in colonies and non-independent states. But there's no weighting scheme that would give us dramatically different trends in the recent period or show more evidence of a recent decline in levels of democracy. Now, of course, there are other data sources, including one which I've already mentioned, namely the varieties of democracy data compiled at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. But if you actually look at the Vden data in detail, then we also don't see much evidence of a clear decline in the global average of democracy. So this figure here shows the global averages for the 5 key democracy indicators in the Vden project. And if anything, the most prominent thing here is that the overall picture looks quite similar to what we saw in the polity data previously. There's only one index, namely the index for deliberative democracy, that has any clear noticeable decline. But even in this case, there's a very modest decline from 2000. Now, upon closer inspection of the Vden data and the reports that this project has produced, where they document what they see as a decline in democracy, it becomes clear that much of the case for democracy being in decline turns out to stem from perceived negative changes in a few specific countries, notably including the US, India, and Turkey. Now, these are admittedly large countries, but I think it's still noteworthy that the perceived changes in these countries are not sufficiently large to make much dent in the global average level of democracy. So since I mentioned the US, let's take a look at the data for the US in the Vden project and what they appear to show about a decline in democracy. So here we have two figures. The figures on the left shows the change in the liberal democracy values for the US compared to the 10-year average. And this figure is taken from an op-ed piece by researchers affiliated with the Vden project in the Washington Post. And this op-ed piece underscores what they saw as a retreat of democracy in the US. The absolute values for the US are shown in the figure on the right. Now, what we can see here is that there's a general upward movement in the index values for the US, but we see some evidence of dips around 9/11 and the Bush administration. And then we see a particularly large decline after Trump becomes president in the US in 2016. Now, I will have more to say about the US later, but in order to understand where this data comes from and what they can tell us, we first need to look at the underlying methodology that's used to produce the Vden data. Now, if you read the articles and documentation produced by the Vden project, we will see that they're based on what we can call expert surveys. And an expert survey is basically projects where individuals with some expertise on a subject are asked to score different questions or indicators. And then these answers can be combined in measurement models to try to come up with some measure that approximates the underlying latent concept that you're interested in this case, democracy. So expert surveys is a very common methodology, and it can obviously be useful for many purposes, especially for things that may be difficult to observe directly. But just like any other type of measurement, the results that we get will inevitably hinge on the inputs that are used. So experts can make errors too. And in some cases, experts may have a host of personal views that influences the particular ratings that they assign. One of the reasons why projects rely on expert surveys, and one of the reasons why they interview many experts, is that if you interview a large number of people and the biases are diverse and random, then they should cancel out in the aggregate when we take the averages. But that's not the case if we have common biases among the experts. So in this case, it seems fair to ask that if the apparent decline in democracy that we see for some countries based on expert surveys could reflect things about the views of the experts rather than features of the phenomenon itself. So rather than institutions actually changing in the US, perhaps what really declines here is more the experts' perceptions of the quality of democracy in the US. There are a number of reasons why this could occur, but in particular, the post-2016 decline probably owes a lot to common antipathies against Trump. Now, since 2016, both the experts working for the Vden project and the rest of us have seen a great deal of news that we may dislike and statements that may disagree with or take offense with during the Trump administration. And it's very possible that this would influence our perceptions about the US, even if we don't have clear cases and institutions per se. Now, we may certainly dislike Trump for many reasons, but I think it's important to note that most definitions of democracy think that democracy is something else than whether we like leaders or the policies that they pursue. So in order to think about whether we have a declining democracy in the US, we need to have some explicit definition of democracy and try to anchor our assessments in that. Now, of course, there are many different definitions of democracy, but I think there are some important elements that are common to many. So it's instructive to try to think how the US would compare on most of this. One important component is competitive election. A prominent definition of democracy is Popper's definition that democracy is a system where we have some option to remove leaders in elections. Or alternatively, we may focus on the role of institutions that provide some kind of check and balance on executive power. Now, by these two criteria, then I think it's questionable whether we really see a shift towards less competitive elections or clear institutional change in the US. Now, part of the reason why Trump was elected was the Electoral College, and we might think that this is a problematic institution insofar as someone could become president without winning the popular vote. But the Electoral College is not in the institutions that have changed, and there have been cases in the past where someone has been elected without winning the popular vote. We also have similar examples in other electoral systems. So in the UK, for instance, there are cases where a party has received a lower share of the vote, yet increased its share of members of the legislature or parliament. And it can be shown mathematically that it's just not possible to have correct representation. Any kind of system of representation will include truncation problems, so we will get outcomes that defy the logic of representation. Now, with regards to checks and balances, it's certainly true that Trump actively used executive orders to bypass the legislature, but so have many other presidents done. Obama, for instance, he claimed the Paris Agreement to be a non-treaty in order to avoid having to seek approval for ratification from a skeptical legislature. And Biden has enacted more executive orders than Trump did in his first 100 days. Now, we may be skeptical of this kind of use of a reliance on executive orders, but it's not something that is unique to Trump. And we shouldn't consider it a problem or not, depending on whether we agree with the content. Now, admittedly, some data sources, such as the Vden project, take a more encompassing view of democracy beyond institution. And in particular, they also aim to identify what they call deliberative democracy or the quality of democracy. But in the case of deliberative democracy, I think it's fair to ask whether deliberative democracy in the US is so much worse now than it has been in the past. To name a couple of examples, we had racial segregation in the US until the mid-1960s. In the 70s, we had the Watergate scandal, where the presidency tried to downplay its involvement in a break-in in the Democratic Party headquarters. And in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan singled out the government as being the problem and called for people to wrestle power from the government and elites. To illustrate some of the more general problems with expert surveys, I'd like to take a brief detour to another important Swedish research project that some of you may be familiar with, namely the so-called Gapminder project. So the Gapminder project was started by the late Swedish physician and statistician Hans Rosling. They collected a lot of data on indicators of development and tools to visualize levels and change in development. But in addition to this, Hans Rosling also carried out a so-called ignorance project, where he tried to investigate what the public knew and did not know about global patterns and macro trends in features related to health and development. The ignorance project includes a series of surveys and factual questions, such as the current global average life expectancy and the change in the share of the world's population living under extreme poverty over the last 20 years. The result of this work is documented in Rosling's book, Factfulness, and they should give us pause to reflect on what can go wrong when we rely on estimating things through popular surveys. In short, the answers that people tend to give about indicators of development are far more pessimistic than the answers that we reach when we look at data on the actual state of the world. For instance, most respondents were convinced that current life expectancy must be much lower than the actual average of around 70 years. And most people also think that poverty has been rising over the last 20 years, even though by World Bank estimates, it has actually more than halved. Now, we could argue that these problems is just what the lay public thinks, and that if you ask experts, then surely we will do much better. But Rosling also conducted his survey in many different settings, including audiences such as university students and academics, politicians, and specialized NGO workers. Rosling did not in general find that the experts did better. In fact, the presumed experts, such as NGO workers and people with university education, actually do much worse on health indicators than the lay public, in that they tended to be more pessimistic. So in this case, all the respondents actually do worse than they would do if we did random guesses in the multiple choice surveys. And they do so because we have a systematic negativity bias, where people tend to be drawn towards the more negative answers. To this negativity bias, we can also add what I call the recency bias, where people often tend to think that the present must be particularly bad, and they long for some kind of mythical past where things were better. Now, I think Rosling's results should give us pause for considering the potential problems that maybe arise in expert surveys. And if experts have problems rating accurately trends in health and development, why should we believe that they could seamlessly assess trends in democratic institutions? Now, why people are convinced that things are bad and getting worse in the area of health and development, it's outside my own area of expertise, but we clearly know that these biases exist. One other issue that I have worked more on myself is beliefs about trends in conflict. And here I think we see similar evidence of negativity and recency biases. So let's try to unpack what we can learn about sources from looking at data on conflict and trends in conflict. If you ask questions to the lay public about the prevalence of conflict, then it's clear that most people believe that conflict is very prevalent, and they tend to be convinced that it's becoming more widespread. They may know that we have relatively few interstate wars, but surveys consistently show that people tend to believe that the problem of civil wars and terrorism is getting worse. Now, I said that this is one area where we now have an increasing amount of data, and the data on trends in conflict is not in line with public perceptions of trends. So very briefly, on the right here, I've shown a graph that shows recent estimates on the number of battle deaths in civil war. Now, clearly, the conflict in Syria is a very severe one. So we see a spike around 2014. But this spike is much lower than what we had before the end of the Cold War. And it's also not the case that things are getting increasingly worse. If anything, we've seen a decline in direct battle deaths since 2014. So that raises the question, why are people convinced that things are getting worse? And here I think the answer resides to a large extent in where we get our information from. Most of us get our information from the news cycle. So we hear about horrible things happening, and events such as war and violence will always be headline news. But we should also keep in mind that front pages will inevitably be biased towards negative events. Something becoming less horrible or something horrible not happening is not front page material. And in those cases where we see improvements and decline of violence, it's just less likely to get attention in the news media. In addition to biases from the news media, we also have a tendency to accentuate the negative, in some cases for well-intended reason, because we want to draw attention to problems and avoid complacency. So for example, in 2018, there was a report by the UN and the World Bank, which wanted to advocate for more investment in conflict prevention, and tried to do so on the grounds the conflict was surging and escalating. Now, I'm all for investing more in conflict prevention, but I think that this report went out of its way in order to interpret data in alarmist fashion. So it relied on the most extreme measures that you can find, looking at number of conflicts instead of severity in order to promote a call for action. But if our goal is to engage in effective conflict prevention, then simply doing alarmism is unlikely to be very helpful. Indeed, it's precisely looking at the cases where we see less violence that are likely to be the most useful in order to understand what could work to limit conflict and to enhance peace. The problem of bias from media events has an important and very instructive, I think, parallel in measures of human rights and what we can conclude about the effectiveness of human rights treaties. Many commonly used indicators of human rights violations rely on media reports or expert assessments, which in turn are determined by media reports, with the so-called singularly enriched data as one prominent example. Now, it's well known that if you look at many such sources, then we would find evidence to suggest that there had been no improvement at all in respect for human rights since the 1950s. In the figure here, the singularly and Richardson data is displayed as gray dots with gray circles. And we can see that there's a flat line with, if anything, some decrease since the 1950s. Studies that have used this data, they've also reached very pessimistic conclusions about human rights treaties, claiming that they don't improve human rights or respect for human rights, because we don't see any improvement once countries sign on to these treaties. Political scientist Chris Ferris, he has emphasized in a series of important articles how we have increasing information about human rights violations that occur now, more so than we did about violations that occurred in the past. And the fact that we know more about things that happened recently relative to what may have happened in the past also means that we're prone to believe that things are getting worse in ways that actually might mask major improvements over time. Beyond noting the problem, Fares has also tried to work on solutions to the problem, and is developed an alternative measure of respect for human rights, anchored in large atrocities that we can observe more consistently over time. And based on this measure, which is shown in the blue lines in the figure on the left, we do find evidence that there's been improvement in respect for human rights over time. And the conclusions that we reach when we look at the effectiveness of human rights treaties also changes dramatically. Remember that with the standard measures, we don't find any evidence that human rights treaty ratification affects violations. But with the revised data, we do find that treaty ratification tends to lead to an improved human rights standard in the countries that sign them. Now, in this case, the difference with the two measures is consistent with what we'd expect from problem with more reporting in a more transparent country. So take an example of Sweden, for instance. Amnesty International documents cases of torture in Sweden because we know more about police abuse. But it's a transparency that allows us to record this, not fundamentally because there's more torture in Sweden than other countries. But this is not just an arcane debate about measurement. It also has real impact on the conclusions that we reach about trends in human rights and important policy questions, such as whether treaties are effective in increasing respect for human rights and preventing violation. Now, although I don't think that there's a clear trend of decline in democracy at the present, I should emphasize that that's not to say that democracy does not face plausible challenges. However, the issues that generate attention now, I think, reflect problems that are enduring rather than recent trends or new phenomena. First, as we've talked about, it's certainly the case that democracy can face challenges from leaders who seek to expand their power at the expense of other institutions, or try to push through constitutional change that may limit representation. Now, we've already seen, we may think that this is problematic, but it can hardly be called a recent trend. It's certainly something that's been widespread in the past. Now, it's also true that some people might make a heroic decision about individual voters and the capabilities that they have as citizens. There are some empirical studies looking at popular beliefs, for instance, that argue that voters are generally unconcerned about democracy and often resemble Homer Simpson more than the calculating individual postulated by Homo economicus when it comes to decision-making and information. And it's also true that popular approval for democracy may be more shallow than is often assumed. But again, if you go back and look at surveys from the past, I don't think it's correct that this is a recent phenomenon. If you look at survey data on satisfaction with democracy, then we don't find any very clear evidence of a recent decline. The figure on the left here shows the data from the World Value Survey, and here the levels are essentially flat, and there's little evidence that alternatives to democracy are becoming more popular in the time. Now, if you see any trends here, it seems to be more based on fundamental changes in the world economy that predate Trump and the current perceived decline of democracy. So we see a decline in satisfaction with the financial crisis, which we know that government satisfaction tends to decline during economic crisis. And it's very likely that such dissatisfaction will spill over to evaluations of democracy itself. And indeed, we have similar impacts of the smaller recession that we saw in the early 2000s with the end of the dot-com bubble. Social choice theorists, they reminded us for some time that there's a tension between majority rule and political institutions that protect specific rights or interests. To make the dilemma more concrete, we can stabilize policies if we create institutions that make it hard to change policies, such as EU standards or fiscal constraints. But if we make institutions so that it's too difficult to change policies, then we could also generate a backlash against them. Now, democratic governance requires a host of very different difficult decisions about how we should weigh individual rights, political competition, agreement on procedures, and how much room there should be for stability versus change. These are definitely difficult issues to get right, but we cannot, by any stretch of imagination, say that there are new issues that we have not seen in the past. I think it's very important to get the diagnosis on the challenges that democracy faces right. If we don't, then we risk a misplaced nostalgia for some kind of pre-decline stage of democracy, which I think is no better defined than the question of when America was at its peak greatness and what it would mean to make it great again. Previous waves of pessimism of democracy have in many cases led to very problematic prescriptions. So currently there's a lot of concern over polarization, but in the 1950s, the American Political Science Association convened a special report on the state of the American party system. And this report worried about precisely the opposite. The report noted with dismay how there was too much convergence between the two major parties, and it called for sharply increased divergence so that the electorate could be offered the clear political choice that was deemed to be essential for democracy. Similarly, in the past, many luminaries on democracy and transition, such as Samuel Huntington and Robert Dole, have asserted with great confidence before the third wave that it was very unlikely that we would see major expansion of democracy. In addition, they also stated that it was especially unlikely in areas such as Eastern Europe and communist regimes, and particularly unlikely to follow from revolutionary overthrow in the case of Dole. A book by Revel in 1985 predicted that Western democracy would perish under competition from an expansivist Soviet Union that it lacked the determination and will to contain. But I think in retrospect, it seems fair to say that what happened was more or less exactly the opposite. And just so you don't think that I singled out other institution, in 1993, the Council of Europe convened a conference at the University of Essex, my home institution, on dissolution with democracy. And this underscores how the concept of what I call democratic hypochondria and pessimism has a long history, and the topic is likely to be with us for a long time. Now, the wrong diagnosis about the problems facing democracy is ultimately unhelpful because it detracts attention from what can matter, both in terms of what makes democracies resilient and what we can realistically influence. Now, this is obviously a very big topic that I cannot fully cover here, but I'm going to focus briefly on what I see as the underappreciated role of protest and democracy. Now, Huntington and many others held the view that democracy was something that was best left to the elites and only introduced cautiously in order to prevent chaos. And even more liberal theorists like Dole argued that it was unlikely that we would get democracy emanating from social or political revolutions. But many of transition in the late 1980s, such as East Germany, did indeed follow large-scale popular uprisings. In more recent work, I've shown that we're substantially more likely to see transitions to democracy following protests in autocracies. And the link from protest to transition cannot just be reduced to reverse causality, where we see more protests before weak regimes fall. Even if we use plausible instrument for protest activity, we do find evidence that the association does not go away. Now, of course, it's going to be the case that countries such as Sudan that embark on democratic reforms after the dictator is removed following protests are likely to face many challenges that make democracy difficult. And we're also more likely to see reversals when democracy emerges under such difficult circumstances. But here again, I think the protest is likely to be an important avenue for democratization, as well as keeping reform processes on track once started. So in countries where civil liberties are deemed to be under threat, such as Poland, we're seeing a fair amount of popular resistance that has had some success in containing proposed changes. And in Latin America, more recently in 2020, the outcome of a constitutional crisis in Peru was strongly influenced by protests, where the initial resignation of members of a controversial new government that some saw as a coup resigned in the aftermath of protests, eventually led to the head of the government resign and the government itself fall. So to conclude, I think democracy clearly faces many challenges, but I don't think the patient is as sick as many argue. Claims about the imminent demise of democracy have been wrong in the past, and so we shouldn't simply prepare for an inexorable death of democracy this time either. Now, as an empirical social scientist, I strongly believe in the value of data to assess the world around us. But we should keep in mind that data are attempts to measure the world rather than the world itself, and we should be aware of the potential pitfalls that we face in trying to interpret them. In a very important chapter entitled Accumulation and Correlation of Results, Robert Jervis recounts the story of Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, who thought they were on the track of an ever-growing number of woozles walking around, oblivious to the fact that the tracks that they were seeing are just their own footsteps from walking around in circles. I don't think that debating whether democracy is in decline is a woozle in the sense that the issues pointed out do not exist, or that the topic is not worth studying. But I think it's useful to ask if we may be changing woozles in order to pose the right questions and try to learn more from them. In this case, we should be mindful that what is often presented as evidence for decline of democracy is problematic, and we should scrutinize the potential problems and try to consider what common data sources may leave out. I think it's a mistake to simply accept the evidence for the trends in data from expert survey without looking at our known biases. We also need to think about whether the problems that we highlight may have existed in the past, even if we have less knowledge about this than we do than the present, given our attention to the news cycle. If we don't do so, then we will get bad history. And in order to understand the present, we need to be able to do meaningful comparisons with the past. And moreover, we shouldn't just be wary of the problem of the wrong diagnosis, but we should try to understand why people arrive at them. When predictions are wrong, it's often useful to try to understand where they came from. And by focusing on things that have gone better than we expected them to, we might actually learn more about important and unappreciated causal relationships. So in my previous work, I've argued that we can use the decline of conflict, despite popular views to the contrary, to learn more about the causes of peace. And I think a similar approach is very useful to learn about challenges to democracy. It would help us understand why democracy has been more resilient than many people have feared, as well as better appreciate trends and plausible scenarios. So in order to draw to a close, I want to emphasize that you may not agree about my skepticism about whether democracy is in decline, but I hope that I have at least provided some food for thought and debate, and I would welcome any questions and comments that you may have. Thank you again for the presentation, the invitation to come to your conference.
Thank you, Kristian, very much. Thank you for this conference. You gave us the opportunity to take a look to important data regarding the democratic scenario, not only, well, focused mainly in the US, right? But as you said, this is not only happening in the US. So it was enlightening to appreciate the graphs and the data and realize that there are far more elements that have an impact on this topic. So, well, one fundamental issue you mentioned was the importance and role the media have nowadays and how this shapes our perceptions. So basically, we're talking about the impact related to misinformation, right? Regarding this topic. So I would like to ask you, regarding this, how can we appreciate this topic, but with what is happening, for example, in countries like Hungary and Poland?
Yes, I think there are two aspects to your question. The first one is how, if we get our information from the media, might this influence the answers that we get? And you mentioned the potential problem of misinformation. I do think that there are cases where we have deliberate campaigns for misinformation, where individuals try to influence views in the media by trying to put them out there. But I think that perhaps the sort of bigger problem is often that the coverage and reporting that we have is partial. And we're currently living in a era where there's less money to be made from journalism and publishing. But we have fewer journalists. We have more cases where media sources simply look to other international news media and reprint sources. And that means that we're going to get more reproduction of the same sources. Now, I don't think that this is ill-intended on the course of the media. I think they try to do the best they can to report the facts as they are known to them. But I think as researchers and citizens, we can do more to try to think about rules of thumb in how we deal with news media sources. So some of them I've hinted at already. So when we see a figure or a data source quoted, we should try to think, where did this source come from? How were these data arrived at? And what may be left out in this particular this particular figure. And we should also be wary of of claims that seem very strong, but seem almost sort of too strong to be true. And in many cases, we cannot all be experts in epidemiology in all contexts of life, but by asking sort of series of simple questions, we might be able to identify cases of things that are more likely to be misinformation, or cases where we have things that are not intended to be misinformation, but partial sources. So the other question is about countries like Poland and Hungary. And here I think perhaps the problem is maybe a little bit the opposite. It's true that, especially in Hungary, that there's been a sort of centralization in news media where key sources have become less hostile to the government, and independent sources have been displaced. But precisely because these remain relatively open societies, I think there's a great deal of coverage of these events in foreign media. So we know a lot about the challenges to the courts in Poland and Hungary. And although this may not be read by all citizens in these countries, I think the fact that many people can access foreign media means that there are independent sources of information, regardless and independent of government efforts to control and centralize. And that's very different from a previous world where we had to rely on printed media and TV coverage that did not extend across national borders. So
I'm sorry, I just silenced my microphone. So I was going to read to you two other questions from our audience. So the first one, which are the limitations of democracy in today's governments around the world? And number two, how the formation
okay, so as I understand the question, this could be interpreted twofold. First is a question of what are the limitations of democracy at government level?
I'm having some problems with my internet connection. Okay, now I'm there, stable. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. So I interpret this question to be twofold. On the one hand, we could have domestic limitations of democracy, where certain type of interests and concerns are less likely to be represented. And then we could have limitations at the international level, where how responsive democratic institutions in one country might make it more difficult to have effective action on a global problem. So we have a large literature on grievances and political mobilization that talk about the first aspect. So it's well known that we have small communities that may be sort of likely to do well in competitive elections. They can often have interests that are marginalized by democratic institutions. And we've seen this with regards to ethnic minority groups in many countries. And if we think of democracy in terms of values such as political rights and so on, we might think that a purely majoritarian form of democratic rule would impinge on important civil liberties and rights for smaller political communities. And that's why I said that in many cases, conflict has been settled by different kind of institutions. So we may have some kind of power sharing institutions where we devolve autonomy or rights to particular communities and therefore protect them from the excesses of majority rule or the neglect of majority rule. So democracy is neither complete majority rule nor only individual rights, but we need to think about what is the optimal mix of these two things and have a continuous debate about how democratic governance is best served by balancing different principles against one another. Now, the other part of this question, as I interpret it, is an interesting one, especially in the context of the pandemic. So in order to effectively contain COVID-19, we need to distribute vaccines globally. As some people have said, no one is safe until everybody is safe. But we've seen a complete failure, including by many democratic countries, in distributing vaccines for global distribution. So most democratic countries have settled down in some form of domestic vaccine nationalism, where they emphasize vaccinating their own population rather than committing vaccines to a fair and equitable distribution globally. Now, I think there are cases where democracies can be more effective, but democracies do not necessarily have an inherent preference or advantage in international collaboration. In many cases, important concerns may not be well captured by incentives that governments face at the domestic level. So I am mindful that there were many things in the chat during the presentation that I didn't have a chance to look at. So if anyone has a question that was posted in the chat, it would be very useful if you could repost it in the question and answer box, and then I will try to do my best to answer them. So I see one hand up, and I'm happy to call on you to make a question if you would like to do so. So let's see, I think we have a hand up from Salvador. Carlos Melén, if you'd like to pose a question.
Salvador, tienes la mano levantada. Si quieres hacer una pregunta, puedes hacerla a través del micrófono. O si alguien más tiene alguna pregunta, puede levantar la mano y le damos la palabra. En lo que llega la moderadora, porque se desconectó unos segundos. Professor, it seems that there is no any other questions for the audience. So also the moderator is gone, has a problem with her internet, so maybe we can finish. Oh, okay, there is a question. Let me see.
Yeah, so
something about democracy and populism. What is the question, Bernardo, if you want? Oh, there is the moderator again.
Yeah, hello, I'm back. I'm sorry, these are the perks of relying on internet, so I'm deeply sorry I had this brief disconnection. So you were reading another question, right?
Yes, there seems to have been a question about democracy and populism.
Okay. So this student has rephrased the question. How is developing democracy, but this time in Latin America? So he's saying he's basically asking us to change the region of analysis because he's interested now on Latin America.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, I think Latin America is a very interesting region. It's seminal for what we consider to be the way of democratization. And so it's instructive to try to think about why military dictatorships were so common and widespread in many Latin American countries, and why we don't see more of this at the present. And I think the things that are happening here is actually a result of many different trends, but perhaps the most important one is that what proved fatal to democracy in many Latin American countries in the past was often the association between crisis and the notion of the military itself as having some kind of guardianship role. So many military coups were often carried out in the context of economic or political crisis, out of some kind of fear that not doing so would lead to chaos and disorder. So that raises the question of why is this not happening at the present? It's not because we don't have any political and economic crisis. In fact, we have many crises in many Latin American countries, but we don't see the military stepping in to take the same kind of measures that they've done in the past when they observe crisis. I suspect that this is probably the product of two different trends. One is that the military, by and large, have poor experiences of ruling, and they've lost their willingness and interest in ruling directly. And the second one is that I think that the association of and the fear of leftism has also declined since the end of the Cold War. In a large number of countries in Latin America, leftist governments have been elected, but they haven't led to the kind of disasters that people assumed they would, at least not in the more moderate leftist parties like Brazil and Argentina. And so I think that there's in a sense, sort of a growing tolerance of the left and respect for democratic institutions that have contributed to make elections and democratic institutions more stable, even if we see a lot of instability at the level of cabinet and dissent in legislatures. So again, I think it's useful to understand why democracy has not been as fragile in Latin America as many people have assumed to be, not trying to distract from the problems that it may face, but to try to understand the larger changes over time. And that's precisely what I meant about doing better history and getting a better handle on challenges and sources of resilience.
Thank you. We have another question, this time from our YouTube audience, and it is related to the region of America again. And it says, is democracy in Latin America currently at risk?
Well, I don't think that democracy is ever completely safe in the sense that it couldn't disappear, but I think it's probably less at risk now than it has been at most cases in the past. Now, we still see challenges of potential abuse of executive power. We still see challenges of corruption. We see challenges of polarization. But again, it would be sort of odd to say that these things have never happened in the past. I think the main challenges in Latin America would be cases where democracy plausibly does not exist, with possibly Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua as important examples. But I think democracy is always at risk, but I think democracy is probably less at risk now than it has been in the past, for the reasons that I tried to outline in the talk.
And well, so far, no. We have no more questions from the audience, so I would invite you, Kristian, to just give us any other comment you want to conclude this conference. Anything you would like to add? Oh, no, just
well, I think I have two comments. The first one is that it's interesting that technology has evolved to the point where we can have presentations spanning different countries and different time zones. As the president of International Studies Association, I'm very keen to see more international collaboration, and I'd like to invite all of you to think about ways that we can use digital technologies to try to have more collaborative activities and research collaboration outside annual meetings. The second point I want to make is just to thank for all the questions and comments that you have made. It has helped me sort of stimulate how I could think about challenges to democracy in Latin America and the larger trends that we may see there.
Kristian, we do have another question. It just arrived. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to read it to you. What would be your opinion on the presidency of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, current president of Mexico? Do you think that his populism is putting in risk democracy in Mexico?
Yes, I did think that this question might come up. And so I did a little bit of preparation. I tried to look at the data that we have for Mexico in common data sources. So I'm just going to go back to sharing the screen very quickly and show you what these look like. Okay, so here we have two figures. Oops. From two different data sources assessing the level of democracy in Mexico. So on the upper graph, we have the polity data. And in the lower graph, we have the Vden data. And so in the polity data, we can see that we have a sort of increase in democracy in Mexico, and it crosses the threshold for what is considered to be a democracy, which is shown by the upper dotted line, around 2000. And again, I'm not an expert in Mexico, but I think that this coincides with the Independent Electoral Institute, which allowed for cleaner elections. and removed a lot of the concerns about electoral fraud that had undermined previous elections. And according to this data, we don't see much change since then. The Vden data are somewhat similar, but here we see a little bit more movement after 2000. And in particular, we see a decline in the deliberative democracy index. So I'm going to stop sharing and go back to looking at it in person. Now, what is the election of López Obrador and his first period in power tell us about democracy in Mexico? I should emphasize that since I don't live in Mexico, I'm reluctant to claim that I know more about this than you do. But I think there are two important things. The first one is that the fact that someone from the left was elected to the presidency of Mexico in the first place is probably an indication of growing tolerance and representation in Mexico. So if democracy is a system where different factions have the opportunity to win electoral power, then it's probably only fair and proper that López Obrador was elected. Now, some people have seen López Obrador as a populist, and sometimes some people have portrayed him as a potential Chavez and someone who may show a dangerous disrespect for democracy. While other people have pointed to that when he was mayor of Mexico City, he was actually a relatively popular mayor and considered to be a reasonably competent administrator. I think in his early part of the presidency, you probably see a bit of a mixed bag. Some people would think that he has sometimes engaged in populist rhetoric. I know there have been cases of allegations and so on that some people see as politically founded. But I think there's also evidence that democracy is doing what it's supposed to do in Mexico. There seems to be an independent press that plays an important role in scrutinizing claims. And even though Modera has a very large share of the seats in the parliament, I think there's also an active opposition. So even if he may have populist tendencies, I think there's also evidence of countervailing effects that should give us some confidence in the future and stability of Mexican democracy.
Well, that's very interesting, Kristian. We don't know. Those were all the questions from our audience. So I'm just no.
Dani, te perdimos. Si quieres apagar tu cámara para poder escucharte mejor, por favor.
Well, if you have lost the connection to the moderator, then I'd be happy to help draw this session to a close. It's quite late in the evening here, and my daughter has just come home from the nursery, so it's a good timing for on my part. But I'd like to thank again to Ame for the invitation to attend this and give this address. And I hope to have a chance to visit you in person at some point and participate in some of your activities.
Thank you so much, Professor Kristian.
Thank you very much, Kristian.
Thank you. Goodbye now, and have a wonderful conference.